Morning, everybody. Welcome to week 6. So this week is officially the Expert Climate Consensus lecture. But then, as Tom mentioned, that's going to be basically the first half up until the break. And then the second half, we're going to talk a little bit about the major IPCC report that just came out this past week. So as usual, here's my background. The relevant bit today is the second to last bullet. I've published about 10 peer-reviewed papers, and several of those have been on the Expert Climate Consensus. So we're going to talk about those papers today. And so let's get moving on to that. And as usual, I want to recommend my book. This week, we have a copy of my book if anybody wants to thumb through it. And I talk a lot about the expert consensus in my book too, so it's relevant to today's lecture. It's got a lot of details that I'm not going to be able to go into in today's lecture. So remember to buy the book. As usual, quick plug for Skeptical Science. A lot of our Skeptical Science team members were co-authors on these consensus papers that we're going to talk about today. That was kind of a really big project that our Skeptical Science team came together to make this happen. So as usual, a recommendation that you check out skepticalscience.com to learn more about climate science, climate myths, and what the science says about these various myths. And then, as usual, plug for my Guardian blog, which is called Climate Consensus, the 97%, for reasons that we're going to go into today. Basically, when we launched our blog, it was happening at the same time as we were publishing one of our consensus papers. And so we're trying to figure out a name for the blog. And so few people are aware of the magnitude of the expert consensus that we thought it's a good idea to put the name in our blog just so that everybody's seeing this 97% all the time. So that's why we called it that. So anyway, to find the blog, you can Google my name, Google Guardian 97%, and go read it and check out what we say every week. OK, so the expert consensus. So there have been a number of different papers trying to quantify how many climate scientists and how many climate science papers agree that humans are the main cause of global warming. And so the very first one of these was published in 2004 by Naomi Oreskes. You might be familiar with her because she she's done a lot of good stuff on, she wrote a book which became a documentary called Merchants of Doubt, which is all about, she's a science historian, but she's got a geology background. But she became a science historian and looked into basically the different ways that industry groups and fossil fuel groups have manufactured doubt about, well, beginning with, for example, the tobacco industry manufacturing doubt about the health impacts of smoking. And then there have been other like asbestos and lead impacts. And they basically used that playbook and used it in climate change. And that's kind of what her documentary and her book is about, called Merchants of Doubt. I highly recommend it. That's a really informative look at how these merchants of doubt have created doubt on the connection between the science and the policy with all these health threats. So at the time in 2004, she was at UC San Diego. And she decided to, at the time, nobody really knew what percentage of climate scientists agreed that humans were causing global warming. And so she thought the best way to figure that out would be to look at a whole bunch of peer-reviewed scientific climate science papers. And she read the abstracts of over 900 of these. And we're going to show on the next slide what an abstract looks like. So she read over 900 of these. And basically, she quantified each one, put them in a category, saying what it says, basically the type of paper it is, and then what it says about what's causing global warming. And so 928 of these she looked at. And of the 928, she found that 0 rejected the concept that humans are causing global warming. So basically, there's 100% consensus among every paper that took a position in their abstract about what's causing global warming, 100% consensus that humans were responsible. So in her category, she estimated that 75% of them explicitly or implicitly endorsed the concept that humans are causing global warming. 25% took no position. And I mean, this is kind of complicated about how you define what an implicit endorsement of human-caused global warming is. So she just came up with their categories, and that was her finding. And she published this paper in Science magazine, which is basically Science and Nature are the two most influential peer-reviewed climate or peer-reviewed scientific journals in the world. So she got this published in Science. So it made a big splash at the time, basically finding no disagreement in the peer-reviewed literature that humans are causing global warming. So this is just an example of a scientific paper, and every scientific paper has an abstract at the beginning. It's basically this paragraph-long summary that summarizes kind of the key points, what the paper is about, and what its conclusions are, what the main what the main things it's looking at are. And so you kind of expect a lot of climate science papers to mention in that abstract what is causing global warming if what they're studying is relevant to that. And so that's what Naomi Oreskes did, because rather than reading the whole paper, because some papers are really, really long, she just read the abstracts of 928 of these. And again, she found none disputing that humans are the main cause of global warming. And so soon after her paper published, and it was getting a lot of attention, there was this guy, Benny Peiser, who he's a climate contrarian. He's worked for a lot of different fossil fuel funded think tanks. And so he didn't really believe her result, and so he wanted to test it, which is fine. It's always good to test a scientific paper's results to see if they hold up. And so he looked at this, all the same 900 and whatever papers that Naomi Oreskes looked at. And he looked at the abstracts, and he wanted to categorize them based on his opinion of what they said about what's causing global warming. And so he initially said, I found 34 of these that reject human-caused global warming, which is about 4%. So not a huge percentage, but a significant percentage. But then his results were kind of scrutinized by other people. They wanted to look at those 34 abstracts that he said rejected global warming, human-caused global warming. And people didn't really agree with his categorizations. And they pressed him on it and said, well, how do you explain your categorization that this paper rejects global warming? And he kind of had to backtrack. And eventually he sort of published kind of a retraction a little bit. He had this quote that said, only a few abstracts explicitly reject or doubt the AGW, which is anthropogenic global warming or human-caused global warming consensus, which is why I've publicly withdrawn this point of my critique. I don't think anyone is questioning that we're in a period of global warming, which is not true. A lot of people question that. Neither do I doubt that the overwhelming majority of climatologists is agreed that the current warming period is mostly due to human impacts. So he kind of said, okay, I looked at all these abstracts. I found some that I thought rejected human-caused global warming. It turns out they didn't really. And so he was convinced that the peer-reviewed literature has this consensus that humans are responsible for global warming, which is kind of an impressive thing, because this, again, is a guy who's worked for a bunch of fossil fuel-funded think tanks. And so it kind of shows that once you actually read the peer-reviewed literature, it's kind of hard to escape this conclusion that all those scientists, all the experts agree that humans are causing global warming. So that was 2004, 2005. And we went a few more years, and then Duran and Zimmerman, a couple of scientists in 2009, published a related study. What they did a survey of these over 3,000 Earth scientists, and they asked them a question: do you think human activity is a significant contributing factor in changing mean global temperatures? So basically, are humans a significant cause of the current global warming? And of those Earth scientists, 82 of them answered yes. But Earth scientists, I mean, they're not necessarily researching climate science specifically. Earth science is like a really large kind of a grouping of research fields. And so they also looked at specifically the scientists in that group who are actively studying climate change. And of those, 97.5% said that yes, human activity is a significant contributing factor to global warming. So the main critique of this study is that of those 3,000 plus Earth scientists, only 79 of them were actively publishing climate science research, and so it's a small sample size. And so often when people critique the 97% consensus, they will critique this paper specifically and say that 97% is based on a small sample size, and so it's not a reliable result. But again, this is just one of a number of consensus studies finding the same result, and so we're going to look at these other ones. Yes?
Well, how many publishing climate scientists are there?
So the question is, how many publishing climate scientists are there? And I mean, that's tough to quantify. So for example, there is a conference every year called the American Geophysical Union Conference, which it's not only climate science, but a lot of the people are publishing and researching in scientific fields related to climate science, and there's about 25,000 scientists there. So it's somewhere in that ballpark, in the tens of thousands of scientists doing climate science research. So that was 2009. The next year, 2010, William Anderegg and a team of scientists that he brought together wanted to do their own survey. But in this case, they're looking at public statements made by climate scientists or people who were doing research or doing something related to climate science. And so they basically put together a really big database of everything they could find, public statements made by people doing research related to climate science. And Again, in this case, they found 97% of those statements accepting human-caused global warming. Another important finding that they found was that the number of publications by these individual climate science-related researchers, basically the number of papers published by the people who accepted the consensus that humans are causing global warming was higher than the number of papers published by those skeptical. So basically, the small percentage of scientists who are skeptical are also publishing fewer papers. And so that's kind of a relevant piece of information, and they published this chart showing that. And so the people who are skeptical of the consensus are in the red bars, and the scientists who accept the consensus of human-caused global warming are the green bars. And so you can see those very first two bars, those are the scientists in their sample who published fewer than 50 papers. And you can see the red bar is a pretty significant percentage of the green bar. And then when you go up to 100 papers, then the red bar is a very small percentage of the green bar. It's much smaller than the green bar. So basically, as a scientist publishes more papers and is more established in the climate science research field, he or she is then more likely to accept human-caused global warming. Sort of as they do more research, they're more likely to come to this conclusion. And as you get further along to 150, 200, 300 published papers, there are very, very few skeptics at that point. Basically, once you get above 100 papers, there's a very high likelihood that a scientist publishing so much research is going to agree that humans are causing global warming. Because once you sort of do so much climate science research, the evidence is so strong it's kind of hard to escape that conclusion. So that was 2010. And then a few years later, 2013, that's when we published our first consensus paper. And so at that time, there was actually, we were seeing the myth that there is no consensus growing. We were seeing more entries of that in the Skeptical Science database, pretty much because somebody doing science or research related to climate science would make some kind of skeptical statement, and then people would say, oh, look, this guy's a skeptic. And then you get one more, and they say, this guy's a skeptic. And then they would say, oh, there's this growing number of skeptics of human-caused global warming, because there would be a couple of them. And so we said, OK, this myth is growing. At that point, it had been almost a decade since Naomi Oreskes' paper had been published. So we said, all right, let's kind of replicate Naomi Oreskes' study, but let's do it on a big scale. So basically, we took our team of citizen science volunteers from Skeptical Science, and we took, so Naomi Oreskes took over 900 papers. We took over 12,000 papers. And so these are papers published between 1991 and 2011, so we looked at that decade. And we created this kind of database tool. So basically how it worked was that we would kind of click a button, and it would pop up with the abstract of a science paper, a climate science paper. And we would read the abstract, and then we would categorize it based on sort of the type of research that it was related to climate science, and then whether or not it said something about human-caused global warming, and whether it said humans are responsible, whether it said something else is responsible, or whether it didn't take a position at all. Because actually a lot of papers in their abstract don't take a position, especially more recent papers, because it's kind of like saying, it's like a biologist in their research paper saying, evolution happens by natural selection. Like, they don't even need to say that because everybody knows that, so it's kind of wasted space. And so a lot of papers don't even mention human-caused global warming in the abstract. But so we had these three sort of major categories: those that said humans are responsible, those that didn't take a position, and then those that said humans aren't responsible, something else is the main cause. So in addition to our team doing these 12,000 abstracts, categorizing them by ourselves, we also decided, just because we figured we were probably going to be accused of being biased, because we had this website, Skeptical Science, that kind of debunked climate myths. So people are going to say that we're a bunch of biased, alarmists or whatever. So we said, OK, let's also email the scientist authors of these papers and have them categorize the papers for themselves. And so we did both those methods. And the end result in both those methods of the papers that did take a position, if you take the ones that don't take a position out of there because they're just not taking a position, of those that do take a position, 97% in both cases of our abstract ratings and of the author self-ratings, 97% said that humans are the main cause of global warming since 1950. So again, we get the same 97% number as the previous study did. And so it's kind of a common occurrence that keeps popping up, this 97% number. Was actually, we weren't certainly aiming for any particular number. We just wanted to see what number we were going to get, and it happened to be this 97%. And so it's kind of a sticky number that it sticks in people's minds if they keep hearing 97% over and over and over again. That's kind of, we're hoping that will kind of get people to recognize that there's this high agreement among climate scientists that humans are causing global warming. So this is a chart of our data that we put together. And so the blue line is our team's ratings of the abstracts of each paper. And the green line is the author's ratings of their own paper. And so as I said, we started in 1991. That's the first year. And you can see even in 1991, the consensus on human-caused global warming is very high. But then over time, it grows a little bit. I mean, it doesn't have very much room to grow because you can't get above 100%. And so it kind of started in like around the 90s or basically high 80s, low 90s. And then it kind of grew. The very last data point we had was 2011. And in 2011, it was a 98% consensus in both the abstract ratings and the author self ratings. 98% as of 2011 that humans are causing global warming. But if we took the average over that entire 10-year period, it was 97%. And then by the end, it had grown to 98%, basically. So that was our 2013 paper. The next year, Bart Verhagen, who's in Norway, I believe. I hope I didn't get that wrong. He put together a team of scientists, and they did their own survey. So it's important to note that we're doing these with different methods. We and Naomi Oreskes were looking at peer-reviewed abstracts and contacting the authors and saying, what does your paper say? Whereas some of the other ones are direct surveys of scientists, earth scientists, climate scientists, asking them, what do you think? And so there's a combination of both what does your published research say and what is your personal opinion. But no matter how we ask this question or what kind of data we use, we're getting the same or very similar results about the consensus. And so what Bart Verhagen did is he did this very big survey of almost 2,000 scientists. Almost half of them were actively publishing climate scientists. And he asked them a whole bunch of questions related to global warming and climate change. A lot of them were very detailed, what's causing it. He went into like human sulfur pollution in addition to the human carbon dioxide pollution, because the sulfur has that cooling effect we talked about in previous classes. So it's a very, very detailed survey. But basically on the question of what's the dominant cause of recent global warming, in his case, 91% of the climate scientists, or the scientists who are actively publishing climate research, said that humans are the dominant cause. And it's a different wording. In this case, it's the dominant cause. And so basically, if you ask the question in different ways, then you get slightly different results, but it's still over a 90% consensus. And similar to Andereg's study, Verhagen's team also looked at the number of papers published by all these different scientists. And again, they found that the scientists who had published more papers were more likely to agree that humans are the dominant cause of global warming since 1950. So we're getting this consistent result that there's an over 90% consensus on human-caused global warming, and that the more papers a scientist publishes related to climate science, the more likely they are to agree that humans are driving global warming. So then, same year, 2014, I believe, same year, yeah. Neil Stenhouse published a paper, and he was surveying members of the American Meteorological Society, the AMS. And so in his case, again, he was asking them questions related to what's causing global warming. But it's important to bear in mind that members of the AMS aren't necessarily doing any academic research at all, let alone climate science research. For example, like TV meteorologists are often members of the AMS, and I mean, they're looking at basically modeling making weather forecasts over short periods of time. They're not looking at anything related to climate change at all. But he wanted to know what AMS members thought. And so he surveyed them, and again, there's almost 2,000 of them. Among those who are publishing climate research, again, it's a small number, it's only 124 in his survey, 93% said that humans are the main cause of global warming. So this particular study, a lot of contrarians actually use it as a way to reject the consensus, because on average, the American Meteorological Society members were not very accepting of human-caused global warming. And so people will say, oh, well, only about half of meteorologists agree on human-caused global warming. And again, that's because a lot of them are focusing on weather forecasts, not doing academic research, certainly not doing climate science research. And so meteorologists aren't necessarily the best people to ask about climate change and climate science, just because that's not their field of expertise. But they are kind of the scientists that people tend to see the most, because you're looking at your local news and you look at the weather forecast, and that's a meteorologist talking. And so he's like the expert of weather that you trust, and so people tend to both be exposed to meteorologists a lot and trust them, because that's where they get their weather forecast information. And so it's kind of a powerful message that meteorologists tend to be more skeptical of human-caused global warming than climate scientists do. but again, they're not climate science experts. And so, I mean, when you're focusing on weather forecasts, that's very different than focusing on these long-term Earth-wide climate changes. So one more study. The next year in 2015, Carlton, he basically took the same survey of Earth scientists as Duran and Zimmerman did in 2009. He took their same questions, and he asked biophysical scientists in the Big Ten universities, which I believe is like Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin, in the Midwest. So he asked them the same questions, basically what's causing global warming, is it humans, is it not? In that case, 92% of those biophysical scientists agreed on human-caused global warming. And of those focusing on climate change research, there was a 97% agreement. Again, that 97% number pops back up. We've been seeing that a lot. So in that case, there were actually 306 of these Big Ten scientists who, in a survey, who were doing active climate change research. So that's a fairly significant number of the 300. That's the 97% consensus in the Big Ten. So at that point, there was a lot, you can see there's a lot of building climate consensus research. And our particular study, because our 2013 paper, because it was such a large study and comprehensive study, we put a lot of effort into the media outreach because we wanted to make sure a lot of people heard about this 97% message because, as I mentioned, there was this growing myth of no consensus. And so we wanted to debunk that myth as effectively as possible, and so we put a lot of effort into reaching out to the media and getting it in newspapers and cable news and things like that. We were pretty successful, and so among climate contrarians, there's a big pushback against the 97% message. Basically, we were battling the myth, and the myth was battling right back against us. And so in 2016, we published kind of a follow-up because a journal had published kind of an attempted rebuttal to our paper, and the rebuttal was very heavily flawed, and so we published a rebuttal to that rebuttal, and so that was our 2016 paper. We call it Consensus on Consensus. And I've got one of our actually this isn't a dog one next. This is a video we put together just explaining what our paper said, and so I'm just going to run the video and let John Cook explain it.
97% of scientists, including, by the way, some who originally disputed the data, have now put that to rest. They've acknowledged the planet is warming, and human activity is contributing to it.
A survey of thousands of scientific papers that took a position on climate change found that 97% endorsed the position that humans are causing global warming.
Some 97% of scientists who have written in peer-reviewed journals say the following: climate change is real, it is significantly caused by human activity.
97% of scientists the world over have said that climate change is urgent and man-made and must be addressed.
For over a decade, study after study has found that 97% of publishing climate scientists agree that humans are causing global warming. But what do the general public think? I'm here at the Brisbane City Mall to find out. What percentage of climate scientists do you think agree that humans are causing global warming?
95%, probably 50%.
75%, I think.
80%, yeah.
85.
Would you like to know who was closer then?
I think I was closer.
100%. Between 5 and 10%?
Not a lot.
Oh, hang on, sorry, other way around. 95%. But split 50-50.
I would say 80%.
95%.
I would say 50.
Off.
There's a huge gap between what many of the public think about the scientific consensus and the actual 97% agreement among climate scientists. Why is there such a large consensus gap? One contributor is misinformation.
The 97% figure that's thrown around, the head of the UN IPC said that number was pulled out of thin air.
That 97% number, that's been debunked in several studies.
This 97% is essentially pulled from thin air.
The stat about the 97% of scientists is based on one discredited study.
97% of all scientists believe...
Is this a bogus number?
It's so not a bogus number.
It's so a bogus
Okay, yours is, mine is, yours is, mine.
From clips like this, you'd think there's a vigorous debate about whether scientists agree that humans are causing global warming. We're often exposed to contradictory messages in the media. How do we see through the misinformation and get to the truth about consensus? I joined with scientists who authored 7 of the key studies into the consensus on climate change. When we look collectively at the wide range of consensus studies, we found that the expert scientific consensus on human-caused global warming is between 90 to 100%. The higher the expertise in climate science, the stronger the agreement on human-caused global warming. When you get to climate scientists who have published peer-reviewed climate research, there's 97% agreement. But the fact that consensus gets stronger with higher expertise is exploited by those looking to cast doubt on the consensus. They do this by selecting groups of scientists that have lower expertise in climate science to get a lower level of scientific agreement and argue that there's no consensus. Using non-experts to cast doubt on the expert consensus is a key characteristic of science denial known as the appeal to fake experts. This approach was employed by Richard Tol in a comment criticising the 97% consensus. Tol misrepresented a number of consensus studies portraying non-expert groups as representative of the expert consensus. The scientists who authored those studies were none too happy with how their research was misrepresented. But on the positive side, Tol's misrepresentation of all those studies brought the authors of 7 key studies together to publish a full view on the scientific consensus on climate change. Our paper established a consensus on the consensus, being between 90 to 100% expert agreement on human-caused global warming, with a number of studies finding 97% consensus.
So yeah, that was our 2016 paper. Basically, we brought together all the lead authors of those papers, the consensus papers that I mentioned. We had basically the authors of 7 different consensus papers come together into this one consensus on consensus paper. And the main conclusion is that the consensus on human-caused global warming is over 90%, most likely around 97%, depending on exactly how you do the survey and how you ask the question. So in addition to these surveys and peer-reviewed studies, there's also National Academies of Science. So of the 80 around the world that have taken a position on global warming, all 80 have endorsed the concept that humans are causing global warming. None have rejected it. So National Academies of Science, that's basically the top scientists in every different country. And so basically all around the world, all the top scientists agree on human-caused global warming. So despite all this, as John Cook mentioned in the video, we have what's called the consensus gap, where we have about a 97% actual agreement. But if you ask the public what percentage of scientists agree that humans are causing global warming, in the United States, the average answer is 55%. So that is a pretty huge gap, 97% reality and 55% perception. That's why we put so much effort into communicating the 97%, because people are really just not aware of this fact. And there have been some good surveys of this. This one is from scientists at Yale and George Mason, where they're doing a lot of surveys of what public perceptions are of climate change and human-caused global warming. And so they've often asked, what percentage of scientists do you think agree are causing global warming? And so this is from, I believe, one of their 2016 surveys. And so going from left to right, on average, 16% of Americans realize that more than 90% of scientists, of climate scientists, agree that humans are causing global warming. And then you kind of break it down by party affiliation. So among Democrats, 26% get this answer right, 23% of independents, 4% of Republicans get it right. And you can break it down even further. Among liberal Democrats, 38% get it right, which is still not great, but it's something. 14% of moderate Democrats, or moderate liberals, 5% of moderate conservatives, and 4% of sort of more conservative Republicans get it right. So basically, as you go on the spectrum from more liberal to more conservative, you are more likely to get this question wrong. And this is like an established, we've got all these different papers establishing that over 90% of climate scientists agree on human-caused global warming. So at this point, it's an established fact. Like, it's just a survey of scientists, it's just a survey of their papers, and there's a bunch of them. Like, there's no question there's an over 90% consensus, and yet only about 16% of Americans are aware of this. And if you're more conservative, you're more likely not to be aware of this. And so, I mean, the reason for that is that people get their news from different sources, and they tend to get their news from sources that are politically aligned with their political ideology. And so basically conservative media news sources are doing a very bad job in communicating the consensus. Often they could try to communicate that there is no consensus if they have a particular bias against doing something about climate change. There's also been a lot of sort of he said, she said kind of reporting. It's gotten better recently, but that was a really big problem over the past decade or so. There was a really good video by John Oliver that I'm going to show here that kind of gets to that point. Very funny video from his show.
If there has to be a debate about the reality of climate change, and there doesn't, then there is only one mathematically fair way to do it.
Last Week Tonight presents a statistically representative climate change debate.
Good evening. Joining me tonight, a climate change denier and, naturally, Bill Nye Science Guy.
John?
Yep.
Humans are causing climate change? No question.
Wait. Before we begin, in the interest of mathematical balance, I'm going to bring out two people who agree with you, climate skeptic, and Bill Nye, I'm also going to bring out 96 other scientists. It's a little unwieldy, but this is the only way you can actually have a representative discussion. Please file in. Again, this is going to make the debate difficult. We shouldn't really be having it in the first place. But, representationally, climate skeptic, please make a case against climate change.
Well, I just don't think all the science is in yet. It's settled.
OK, and what is the overwhelming view of the entire scientific community? OK. Any response to that? Any response? I can't hear you over the weight of scientific evidence. This whole debate should not have happened. I apologise to everyone at home. My thanks to Bill Nye and the overwhelming scientific consensus.
Okay, so that's like my favorite video in the whole world. I love that video. So he makes two really important points. First of all, he says we shouldn't be having this debate at all. Like, if you're going to be talking about climate science on some news program, you shouldn't be like debating whether or not it's happening. You should be like having a representative discussion of what the scientific research says. And if you're going to have a debate, it shouldn't be this one-on-one, one skeptic and one like mainstream climate scientist debate, because that's not representational of what the climate science research says. And so a lot of news programs, cable news programs, nevertheless took this approach for a long time. CNN was kind of the poster child where they were bringing the one skeptic and then the one scientist, and it was often Bill Nye representing like the actual, even though he's not a climate scientist, somehow he became sort of the representative for the climate science community. And they would have this one-on-one debate, and like if you're just watching two scientists or scientist-looking guys debate, it's really hard to know which one is right. You just think this guy says yes, this guy says no. Who's right? I don't know. I'm just watching. I'm not an expert. So you get this perception that, well, half of the scientists agree that humans are causing global warming. Half of them think humans aren't causing global warming. And that's why when you survey Americans, they say the average, their average answer is about what percentage of scientists agree on human-caused global warming is 55%, because they're getting this like 50% on this side, 50% on this side perception from watching the news. So that's been a problem. It's gotten better on most cable news stations. I think there are certainly some biased conservative cable news stations that still do a very bad job about this. But like CNN, for example, I think has gotten a lot better about not doing these terrible one-on-one debate things anymore. So that's been encouraging. So the reason consensus, people's perceived consensus is so important is that there's been a lot of social science research finding that what they call a gateway belief, where if you if your perception of the expert consensus is high, and you think the experts agree, and then you are more likely to accept humans are causing global warming, and then you're more likely to want to do something about it. So this chart I put together from a really interesting paper published a year or two ago, where they did a survey of people in these 6 different countries: Canada, China, Germany, Switzerland, the UK, and the US. And they asked them a whole bunch of questions about whether or not they were concerned about climate change and what they thought was causing it. And they were very specific questions, but generally it broke down to what they thought was causing it: humans or natural effects. And so you can see the left chart, or the left bar for each of these countries. The left bar is sort of the level of concern about climate change, and the right bar is the level of knowledge that humans are responsible for it. And so you can see there's this strong relationship between the two bars. Basically, if the left bar is big, then the right bar is probably big. So you can see kind of the outlier there is the United States. We have the lowest concern about climate change of these 6 countries, and by far the lowest knowledge of the fact that humans are responsible. So that 55% answer that's the average answer of Americans. Most countries do better. John Cook in his video showed 66%, I think. That was Australia. So basically, in different countries, there's these different perceptions of the consensus. Most countries, people still underestimate it, but very few countries underestimate it as much as Americans do because we've got this particularly polarized media landscape. But the good news here, I think in particular, is the China bars. So in China, they have very high concern about climate change, which I think is in large part related to their air pollution problem because the air in China is really gross. And so when you got this air pollution staring you literally in the face every day, it's kind of hard to deny the human impact on these surrounding environments. And so they also kind of recognize, okay, well, we're doing this to the environment, then we also have this impact on the climate. And so in China, people are very aware, very concerned about climate change, and correspondingly, they also are very aware that the humans are responsible for it. And so you can see most of the countries do pretty well. China does very well, and the United States does very poorly. Question in the back? The question is, have they done this survey for California? There have been surveys. It's that same Yale and George Mason team has done, I believe they're the team. And actually, the next chart is going to show a little bit of this. But they have done surveys of different states in the United States, which do better. And basically, none of the states do very well on this question. But generally, the liberal states do better than the conservative states. California does relatively pretty well and correctly, both being concerned about climate change and incorrectly recognizing that humans are responsible. Let's move on. We got a break coming up. We can ask questions in the break. The numbers on the left are just kind of their scale that they put on it. So they kind of categorize it from 0 to 7, the level of the answers, and so that's just kind of the scale they used in the study. So telling conservatives about the consensus particularly turns out to make a difference. And so this chart is showing basically the lighter green to the darker green. As you get darker, then basically what they did is they asked people what their perceived expert consensus was, and then they told them about the 97% consensus results, and then they asked them afterwards what their new perceived consensus was, because there's this myth, well, it's kind of there's some truth to it, but there's this perception that facts don't matter anymore, which, I mean, to be fair, that's often the case, that facts kind of bounce off of people and don't make a difference in their perceptions of the world anymore. But the good news, so there was this worry that if we tell people about the 97% consensus, because they have this bias that's affecting their views on everything, telling them about the consensus won't change their perception. They'll still say, no, that's not true. I don't believe that piece of information. So the good news is it did make a difference, especially among conservatives who they started out with this low perception of the consensus, and then the scientists informed them of the 97%. They asked them again. And so you can see the darker green states are the particularly conservative ones, like West Virginia, North Dakota. California didn't make a big difference because we already had a relatively high perception of the consensus, and that's generally true of most liberal states. So the encouraging result from this study was that facts, in some cases at least, do matter. It does make a difference if you inform conservatives who have a particularly low perception of the consensus. You tell them that there's a 97% consensus. It does make a difference and raise their perception of what the level of expert consensus on human-caused global warming is. So that's encouraging. And then why it matters, to me, it's because expertise matters, because each of us, we can't know everything, unfortunately. I would love to know everything and be an expert in everything. Unfortunately, I'm not. And so, for example, when I get sick, I go to the doctor. I don't try to diagnose myself. I might go on WebMD a little bit just to see what it says. But I know I'm probably going to misdiagnose myself, and so I'll go to the doctor because the doctor is the expert. The doctor has been to medical school. The doctor spends his or her career diagnosing and healing people, and so that's the expert. And so I'll go to the doctor rather than trying to, put a splint on myself and hope that I don't end up with a crooked arm. Or if my car breaks down, I know very little bit about cars, and so I don't even try. I just take it to a mechanic because I know if I try to fix my car, I'm just going to screw something up, and it's going to end up really bad. Whereas the mechanic, again, has been to school, has spent his or her entire career fixing cars, can probably fix my car a lot better than I can. And so I think that's generally, people understand that I can only be an expert in so many things. If I have a problem that I'm worried about, I'm going to go to an expert and figure out what that expert thinks. And so there's another myth that basically consensus doesn't matter because sometimes the consensus is wrong and therefore consensus is unreliable. But that's that doesn't hold up in the real world. We need to talk to experts. Yeah, and so there's also this myth about Galileo so basically, there's a good quote from Rick Perry who said Galileo got outvoted for a spell, meaning that the perception or what he was trying to argue is that there was a consensus that the sun revolved around the Earth at the time, and Galileo said, no, the Earth revolves around the sun. The Earth isn't the center of the universe, as people tended to think. So that was actually a Catholic Church generally held belief, that humans and Earth are the center of the universe. And so the Catholic Church didn't like that Galileo was trying to use science to say the Earth goes around the sun, because that conflicted with the church beliefs. And so the Catholic Church suppressed Galileo. But many of Galileo's scientific contemporaries actually agreed with him. There's actually been, for a long time, there have been scientists who, in different cultures in different parts of the world, who have come to the conclusion based on scientific evidence that the Earth revolves around the sun. And so this wasn't a case of sort of Galileo going against the scientific consensus and proving by himself that the scientific consensus was wrong. In fact, the scientific evidence was on Galileo's side. And so science is evidence-based, and the opposition to Galileo was not evidence-based, it was belief-based. And so the argument that Galileo got outvoted for a spell is not an argument based on consensus being overruled by one scientist. It's an example of a scientist overruling a popularly held belief that was not based on science, it was based on religious beliefs. So that's just a bad example by Rick Perry, but it's it's one that we hear relatively often, that, consensus is wrong. Like, look at Galileo. Galileo disproved the consensus, and so we can't trust consensus. And so then the question is, okay, in what cases can we trust an expert consensus? Because in some cases, there is sort of a widely held scientific belief that gets overturned over time by a growing evidence. And so another colleague of mine, we've seen some lectures of his from Denial 101X, Peter Jacobs. He's at George Mason, and he sort of put together this concept of a knowledge-based consensus, and I'm going to let him explain. He published a paper on the subject, and he did a lecture on it.
In a debate, just having a bunch of people agree isn't enough. Groups of people agree and turn out to be wrong all the time. So what makes a scientific consensus different? Scientific consensus is different because it relies on three important ingredients: evidence, everyone involved agreeing upon standards for that evidence, and agreement from many different groups from many different backgrounds. In the study of the philosophy of science, we would say that consensus is likely to be correct when it is knowledge-based. And consensus is knowledge-based when it meets three important criteria: consilience of evidence, social calibration, and social diversity. Consilience basically just means having many lines of evidence that are independent from, but in agreement with, one another that all point to the same conclusion. You can think of it like this. A friend is cleaning out his old games and gives you a bunch of different puzzle pieces. He was cleaning in a hurry and just threw pieces in an old shoebox. You don't know what the puzzle will look like, or even if the pieces are really from the same puzzle. Maybe the pieces look like they're all showing something similar, but don't actually fit together. Or maybe the puzzle pieces sort of fit together, but look like they would have to come from very different pictures. When pieces of the puzzle fit together and show a picture that makes sense, you can be confident that you're on the right track. Science depends on evidence coming together and telling the same story. When we look at the average temperature of the Earth, we can see a bunch of different lines of evidence pointing to the same conclusion. Thermometers on the ground, on ships in the ocean, and on balloons in the air all show an increase in temperature. Glaciers around the world are melting. Sea level is rising. Moisture in the air is increasing. All of these things tell us that the world is getting hotter. The pieces of the puzzle fit together, and the picture is clear. Evidence is a big part of what makes science successful, and that means we have to make sure that we're all using the same standards of evidence and speaking the same language. Figuratively, at least. We call this social calibration. It may sound obvious, but people need to be in agreement about the concepts that they're discussing before they can come to a meaningful conclusion. To be able to address the question of whether the planet is warming, you have to agree on some basic concepts. It might sound silly to you and me, but there are climate contrarians who actually deny that there is even such a thing as global temperature as a concept. But of course we can take temperature measurements from across the planet to get an average of the whole global temperature. People need to agree on what counts as a valid way of answering a question as well. Someone might feel that the answer was revealed to him in a dream. Someone else might have claimed to have found an answer in an ancient prophecy. But when dealing with scientific questions, it's important that we're relying on the rigorous standards of scientific inquiry. Consilience of evidence and social calibration are important, but it might still not be enough. To be really confident that the consensus is correct, it also helps to see agreement coming from many different groups from many different backgrounds. In other words, we want to see social diversity. To understand why, it helps to look at cases in which a lack of social diversity can lead to the wrong conclusions. One is just plain old bad luck. It's always possible to reach a conclusion of yes when the answer correctly is really no, or vice versa. It could be a statistical fluke, or contaminated materials, or even something dependent on the location of the group performing the experiment. Having many different groups from many different backgrounds can do a lot to rule out such problems. Another way in which a lack of diversity can lead to agreement that turns out to be wrong is groupthink. There's a tendency for groups of small numbers or highly similar groups to attempt to minimize disagreement and promote conformity. A desire for harmony within the group can cause people to ignore reservations they may have and reach agreement for the sake of agreeing rather than based on standards of evidence. A large, diverse group will have less of an inclination towards groupthink, as differences among the group exist from the outset. Cultural bias is another way in which a lack of diversity can lead to incorrect conclusions. Scientists are a product of their cultures, and different cultures have different preferences for how the world should be. Including scientific viewpoints from as many different cultures as possible helps ensure that agreement isn't the product of values rather than evidence. Over 80 national science academies around the world agree that humans are causing global warming. None disagree. Having a socially diverse consensus also guards against self-deception or outright fraud. Those with no stake in the outcome or who stand to lose rather than gain from the outcome, reaching the same conclusion as those who might benefit from it, increases our confidence that the conclusion is correct. The consensus on climate shows clear social diversity. Keeping these conditions in mind, we can look at examples from the past when consensus supposedly has been wrong. Climate contrarians are fond of holding up such examples as reasons to doubt the current consensus on climate as correct. A frequent example is that there was a consensus in the scientific community against continental movement, which plate tectonics later proved to be wrong. But is this an example of a knowledge-based consensus that failed? Does this example meet the conditions of consilience of evidence, social calibration, and social diversity? Let's assume that we're talking only about physical scientists actively engaged in the issue. For the sake of argument, we'll say the condition of social calibration was met. There was no consilience of evidence against continental drift. Some evidence that land masses moved was known for hundreds of years, but the evidence didn't point conclusively towards a coherent picture from movement. Perhaps more interesting was how disagreement on this issue was related to nationality. Scientists with basically the same training, looking at the same evidence, were coming to different conclusions based on where they lived. Science historian Naomi Oreskes has shown how the cultural ideals among geologists in North America differed from those from Europe, and how that affected their scientific views. Scientists in America tended to value democracy and were hostile to authoritarian decrees. They favored bottom-up, inductive methods of interpreting the evidence. They were leery of top-down, big man, big theory explanations. And so they were resistant to the evidence for a continental drift in a way that their peers from Europe or South Africa and Australia weren't. Opposition to continental drift was not a consensus, and definitely not a knowledge-based one. Other examples used to cast doubt on the modern consensus on climate fare about the same. When the pieces of the puzzle fit together, you have consilience of evidence. When everyone is using the same standards of evidence and speaking the same language, you have social calibration. And when agreement is widespread across many different groups of people from many different backgrounds, you have social diversity. And when you have all three, you have a knowledge-based consensus, and you can be confident that it's correct.
Okay, so basically the consensus on human-caused global warming is based on evidence. There's a lot of evidence. There's been like hundreds of thousands of relevant peer-reviewed papers. As we saw, about 97% of those papers agree on human-caused global warming. And that's why all the scientists also agree, because the evidence has convinced them. And these are scientists all around the world from all different cultures, and all of them agree, 97% agree on human-caused global warming. So that's the end of the consensus bit. After the break, we're going to talk about the new IPCC reports. So if you have any questions during the break, come talk to me. You can have a look at my book if you're interested, and we'll come back at about 11:05.